Hey, everyone, and thanks again for tuning in. I want to send a special thanks to Assistant Attorney General Clark for his great comments about what's happening over at the Department of Justice. I think it's been a very important component to the ILR program to address over-enforcement, and the DOJ has certainly been taking a close look at turning the tide on that. So our first panel today showed some pretty troubling data about our tort system and its impact on American small businesses. Chuck's story in particular really hit home for me. And if you remember, he said that when the trial lawyers filed their Prop 65 complaint against him in California, they were looking for $1 trillion in fines. That's $1 trillion with a T and 10 zeros that follow it. Now, that's ridiculous on its face, and I think we can all agree on that just based on being reasonable people. But it's not hyperbole. It's something that we constantly see when it comes to the plaintiffs' bar. And unfortunately, far too many defendants get taken for a ride. So for this next panel, we're going to talk about the alarming rise of nuclear verdicts. Nuclear verdicts sounds ominous, sounds somewhat apocalyptic. And these are jury verdicts that are generally understood to exceed $10 million. But in a lot of other ways, nuclear verdicts dole out damages that are usually disproportionate to the actual injuries sustained. In other words, these are eye-popping amounts from juries that are driven by punitive and non-economic damages. More on that later. You know, we've seen these verdicts spread throughout the country in many areas of litigation. I'm talking about everything from product liability to commercial trucking accidents. And to help us get a better understanding of what's really going on and what to do about it, we have a terrific panel of experts with insights from 3 unique viewpoints. First, the insurance world. Second, from the counsel table. And then third, the jury box. First, we're going to hear from Yafit Cohn, who serves as Vice President and Chief Sustainability Officer and Group General Counsel for the Travelers Companies. She's done some excellent research on nuclear verdicts and how they're being shaped by social dynamics, which is going to be a real focal point of our discussion today. Our next speaker is Bob Tyson from Tyson Mendes out in sunny Southern California in San Diego. He's a very well-regarded defense lawyer who practices in one of the most challenging jurisdictions in the country. Talk to Chuck Jones about this, California, the Golden State. Earlier this year, Bob came out with a book titled Nuclear Verdicts, Defending Justice for All. This is the actual book. I read it over the summer. It's a quick read. I'd encourage you to read it. And it's about how the plaintiffs' bar has built a machine that runs on rage and fear-based verdicts and some very specific tactics that is part of a huge playbook. And the book talks about what defense lawyers can do to basically disrupt this dynamic that's happening in our courtrooms across the country. And last but not least, we'll certainly hear from Dr. Christina Maranakis, who serves as Director of Jury Research for Litigation Insights, a multi-service trial consulting firm with offices around the country. Christina is an expert when it comes to jury psychology with extensive experience advising defense litigators in tough cases. And she's also published some excellent pieces on counteracting the Reptile Theory and its effects on juries. And again, more on that later. So Yafit, let me start with you. Thank you for being here. And actually, I do have a quick housekeeping item that I forgot. If folks want to ask questions, you should go to www.slido.com and enter the event code ILR Summit 20. Again, it's www.slido.com. And all of that information hopefully should be at the bottom of your screen as well. And we'll try to make time for any questions at the end of this segment. So Yafit, let's get back to you. Are nuclear verdicts a real thing, or is this fake news?
Thanks, Harold, and thank you, ILR, for having me today. It is definitely not fake news, Harold. It is definitely a real thing. What we're seeing now is a dramatic increase in the frequency of nuclear verdicts, whereas in the past, they've been pretty rare, relatively speaking. So just to give you a sense, since 2011, the annual number of verdicts greater than $5 million has increased by over 50%. And the size of the awards is increasing as well. So again, to give you a sense, in 2019, there was a 300% increase in the number of $20 million awards versus the average from 2001 through 2009. And I wanted to just mention a recent example I've read about earlier this month. There was a personal injury case against a trucking company in which a Florida jury awarded $411 million to a plaintiff who was injured in a pileup on the interstate. And I think the verdict in itself makes the case notable, but to me, it was especially interesting that the trial, including jury selection, was conducted entirely over Zoom and took place in just one day, which was just absolutely stunning to me. I wanted to talk a little bit about the reasons for those trends as well. Why are we seeing that rise in nuclear verdicts? I think that there's been a major shift in juror attitudes in recent years. That's definitely a major factor here. So to give you an example, in a 2019 survey, 75% of potential jurors said that they would decide a case based on their own personal beliefs of right or wrong, even if those beliefs conflicted with the law as instructed by the judge. And among millennials, that number jumped to 82%, which indicates that this is a shift that could accelerate in the coming years. So if we're to take those survey results seriously, if they're reflective of reality, I personally think that should concern all of us. Another trend that we're seeing that is relevant here is that over the last few years, the public's view of big business has soured considerably. According to a 2019 survey, approximately 9 in 10 jurors believe that companies should be punished for bad behavior, even if those practices caused no harm to anyone. And a 2018 study noted that 2/3 of jurors assume that a claim is legitimate as long as it makes it into a courtroom. So obviously, these views and attitudes are not the only factor behind the rise in nuclear verdicts, but they are a significant factor. You know, you mentioned the reptile theory. I think that's part of it, and I know Bob will discuss that shortly. I think that has an important role to play here as well. There could be other factors at play, including the desensitization of the public to large dollar figures. But I think it's important to note that the rise in nuclear verdicts is not the result of increased malfeasance on the part of defendants. There does not seem to be evidence for that. So in the end, nuclear verdicts and the trends that are driving them, from my perspective, are undermining the fabric of our judicial system, which is founded on the bedrock principle of impartiality. And they're contrary to the purpose of tort damages, which is, of course, to compensate the plaintiff for injuries sustained.
Well, thank you, Yafit. You know, you mentioned one of the cases involving the trucking industry, and I know that the issue of nuclear verdicts has been a real concern for the men and women, you know, with the big rigs helping our supply chains during this global pandemic move goods, move groceries, move medicine. And they really seem to be in the crosshairs of some significant nuclear verdicts that we've seen across the country. And so what does this mean when it comes to insurance markets, specifically when it comes to commercial insurance?
Yes, great question. So I absolutely agree the trucking industry has been disproportionately affected here. The increasing frequency of nuclear verdicts in the trucking industry is reportedly driving insurance premium increases as high as 50 to 100% in any given year. And a lot of trucking companies just can't sustain those types of costs. They've been forced out of business as a result. And like you said, that all threatens the viability of an industry that's proved itself to be essential in the era of COVID-19. Just to give you an example, ALA Trucking of Indiana had actually publicly reported that its insurance premiums increased from $340,000 to $700,000 in 1 year, which forced it out of business and cost about 56 people their jobs. So turning to insurers have really been having difficulty adequately pricing liability coverage to account for these nuclear verdicts. And unsurprisingly, like you said, these outsized verdicts have taken a toll on the commercial trucking insurance market specifically, which has resulted in 9 years of loss ratios in excess of 100% in the commercial auto segment, including a record 108% loss ratio in 2018. So for those of us who are not insurance professionals, what that means is that in 2018, for every dollar that the insurer took in premium, it paid out $1.08 in losses. More generally, if we take a step back, what I'm seeing is that even major insurers are finding that their financial results are being impacted by social inflation, including nuclear verdicts. And over the last couple of years, social inflation has played a major role in insurers' decisions to increase their reserves, as well as to increase the price of their products. And I should also mention, I know that you didn't ask specifically, but the ripple effects of nuclear verdicts are really extending beyond the impacts on insurance. What we're seeing is that the economic uncertainty created by the legitimate concern of a nuclear verdict is in itself an impediment to the smooth operation of a business. And if we come back to trucking, since that seems to be our theme here today, the rate a trucking firm charges has to take into consideration that possibility that one of these irrational results could result from even a single accident. And more generally, in any industry, businesses downstream from the company and its suppliers are also impacted, as is the end consumer, who is now paying more for everything from groceries to transportation to healthcare, et cetera. And I just wanted to mention on that note that ILR has estimated that as of 2016, the costs of the US tort system, including as a result of nuclear verdicts, are about $429 billion, which is the highest of any country in the world. And if we want to put that in perspective, we could look at it as, if the total costs of the tort system were shared evenly among American families, every household would be responsible for about $3,300 per year. So in other words, the tort liability costs have soared well beyond the level necessary to discourage reckless and negligent behavior and to compensate those harmed. And all Americans are now paying for that in the end. And finally, in this environment, I think we should all be concerned with the possible impact of a runaway tort environment, including that risk of a nuclear verdict, on the willingness of companies to take that necessary risk to develop vaccines or therapeutics to help with the current pandemic and otherwise to keep the economy functioning.
Thank you, Yafit. Now, Bob, we could spend probably 3 hours talking about the root causes of all this. I mean, I could point to advertising. You go down the I-10 corridor down in Louisiana and you see the big rig trucking accident billboards just plastered everywhere from Texas to Louisiana. You get third-party litigation funding. We've talked about social inflation. But Bob, you have a unique perspective on this, and that's what's really happening in the trenches when it comes to litigating these cases. And one thing that we've talked about earlier is the so-called reptile theory. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that, and then how your book offers to slay that reptile?
Thank you, Harold. Thank you, ILR, for having me here. I guess unique is kind of code for simple. I mean, I'll be honest with everyone, I'm just a simple trial lawyer, all right? Very simple, out here in California. And I'm not going to be able to effectuate countrywide change. So I'm focusing on what's going on in trials. Like a nuclear verdict isn't happening because someone funded it. I mean, you're in the trial. What happened? And what's happened is plaintiffs' lawyers have completely changed the way they try cases. In the last 10, 15 years, they've completely changed the way they try cases. And what they're doing now is they're going for a new emotion. It used to be sympathy. When I first started trying cases 30 years ago, you always worried about what kind of witness impression the plaintiff was going to make. Now, the emotion they're going for, and the number one driver of nuclear verdicts is anger. Anger. So in the last 10 to 15 years, plaintiffs' lawyers have changed the way they try cases. They're trying to get the jury angry. And one method, one tactic that plaintiffs are using is this book that was written called The Reptile Theory. And the Reptile Theory was written by a gentleman named David Ball, who also wrote the Bible on damages for plaintiffs' lawyers called Ball on Damages. And they've come up with this technique to essentially get juries scared. Get juries scared. And it's an illegal technique. He has a whole part of his book devoted to getting around each of the 50 state laws outlawing the reptile theory. So he knows it's illegal, but what he does is the reptilian brain is the part of the brain that causes you to want to live, want to survive. So every case that they have, they try to put the jury in the shoes of the plaintiff and get them scared. What if you were the plaintiff? And that's completely improper. We bring motions to keep this out, but judges across the country let it in. So we have to do more than that, because they're claiming, the book came out in 2009, they're claiming just the last 10 years or so, they've gotten over $8 billion in settlements and jury verdicts by using this method. So the whole way that plaintiffs' lawyers have changed the way they try cases, completely changed.
Well, so how do you diffuse that anger? I mean, I know that there's some details in your book, from pretrial discovery, how to detect it, to what to do during the course of trial itself. I'd like to get your thoughts, just an overview. And then Christina, as a jury consultant dealing with jurors, perhaps you can give some more dimension in terms of how this is playing out with jurors and how frequent are you seeing this? So Bob, you first, and then Christina, you next.
Yeah, no, great. I'm glad you've asked, Harold, because my answer is simple. Do something. Do something. I mean, think about it. Over the last 10, 15 years, what are you, if you're a defense lawyer out there, or if you're someone who hires defense lawyers, what are your lawyers doing differently? I'll let you list all the different things they're doing in the chat if you want. Go ahead, list them all. I don't think defense lawyers are doing anything differently. I don't think we are. We have to do exactly what you said, Harold, which is we have to change the way we look at cases. The plaintiffs now, for the last 10, 15 years, are trying to get juries angry. We have to figure out how to diffuse that anger. The good news is you guys out there have the power, okay? We defense lawyers, we do whatever you want. And if you want us to focus on defense, on nuclear verdicts, we can do that. We will do that. We respond to what our clients want. So there's three things that I think you guys can do out there to stop nuclear verdicts, and to stop them pretty soon, I think. It's educate, communicate, and compensate. With respect to educate, you're right, Harold. I could write a book about this, all the things the defense should be doing differently. But we don't have time for that. But I think many of you have the book out there, which is great. It goes through exactly what can be done. I'll give you 4 things off the top of my head that you guys can do, that you should be asking your lawyers. Are you going to do this? Because you have to start changing the conversation. It isn't how are we going to win, how are we going to stick it to plaintiff, or whatever the tactic might be traditionally, how are we going to prove the plaintiff is a liar? You have to think, how am I going to diffuse anger? Off the top of my head, there's 4 things you can do. Accept responsibility, have the defense give a number, right? Each one of these takes an hour to discuss in detail, right?
Yeah.
Personalize the corporate defendant, and argue non-economic damages. As you said to start all of this, non-economic damages are a big part of runaway jury verdicts, of nuclear verdicts. And if you read the closing arguments in most nuclear verdicts, and I read the actual closing arguments, what are the lawyers doing to get these verdicts? What are defense lawyers doing to stop it? They don't even argue non-economic damages. The last 2 things are communicate. We defense lawyers don't share anything with each other, or very little, nothing compared to the plaintiff's bar. Ask your defense lawyers to at least share with each other. If you hire a lot of different defense lawyers, ask them to share information with each other. Compensate. Biggest difference between plaintiff's lawyers and defense lawyers, compensation, right? They only get paid if they win. We get paid either way. I get paid the same amount of money for doing a summary of medical records as I do giving a closing argument in a $75 million products liability case. Come up with a system that maybe moves away from hourly, is more value-based. What value are your defense lawyers bringing to the table? Get your defense lawyers to worry about what you're worried about. You don't go to bed at night worried about whether a summary was done correctly. You worry about a case that's in trial. Incentivize your defense lawyers, use success fees based upon the savings they achieve you. And we're rolling out a new firm to do this across the country. We parachuted in and try the scariest cases based upon value billing. So there's 3 things, Harold: educate, communicate, compensate.
Well, thank you, Bob. Christina, what say you?
Well, I think a lot of things that jurors have said and that we've studied are showing that the reptile theory is so effective for many of the reasons that Yafit mentioned, the anti-corporate bias. In psychology terms, we call it availability heuristic. What people hear in the news tends to be top of mind, and people assume that that is more common than it actually is. So I'm sure you all are familiar with anchoring, right? Where the plaintiffs are asking for such a high number, knowing that that's going to anchor the juror's award. Well, when they have these verdicts being in the news all the time, and especially on social media, it's always top of mind, these $80 million verdicts, $5 billion verdicts. So when jurors are in the deliberation room, that's what comes to mind. And we've seen that in mock trials where we're watching them deliberate through the glass. And we've heard people say, well, they gave that lady that had cancer $80 million, So what is this case worth? And now the anchor comes not just from the plaintiff attorney, but from the news media that they're seeing and the verdicts that they're seeing on social media and elsewhere in the news. So you have that. You have this anti-corporate bias, which has definitely gotten worse in the years, as Yafit pointed out. But then you also have another factor, which is victimization and locus of control. And that's why the reptile theory is so effective, is because it plays on people's fears that they already have. And we are seeing more and more that people feel like their lives are out of their control. And previous generations had what we call a high internal locus of control. They felt that the decisions they made determined the outcome of their success in life. And now we're seeing more and more, especially with millennial jurors, where they feel like they can go through and do exactly what was expected of them, go to college, get straight A's, and they still can't get a job. And so they feel like the system is against them. And when you have that victimization feeling, it is easy for plaintiff attorneys to capitalize on that and to talk about the victimization of society and the community and not being able to get past what corporations are because they have the control. And so we've actually done studies where we've asked jurors questions to identify whether they have an internal locus of control or an external, whether they feel like other people have a bigger impact on their life. And then we've also asked them questions about their own fears, not related to the lawsuit, but just fears in general. Are they a worrisome type of person? Do they worry about getting cancer? Do they wear sunscreen? Do they avoid certain foods like GMOs? And what we found is that there's a very high correlation between people who are fearful just in their daily lives, and they tend to be worrywarts. They are more likely to become plaintiff jurors than people who generally go about their day not worrying about those things. So plaintiff lawyers know that, and they select those jurors, or they seek out those jurors during jury selection to try to find the people who are going to be most susceptible to those types of tactics. Now, the other thing at play is social responsibility and change. And we are seeing more and more that people want to make a difference in the world, especially young people. And we're seeing young people want to serve on juries, even though they're not going to be paid, because they want to make a difference. Again, they feel victimized. They feel like they don't have control. And with a lawsuit, they can make a difference to the world. And plaintiff lawyers use that. And so you'll hear them say, a plaintiff lawyer in a reptile type opening might say something like, "You all have been selected because we have faith in your ability to change the world." They'll ask in jury selection, the decisions you make in this case could determine whether people live or die. Is anyone not up for that type of responsibility? And what that does is that instills these jurors to want to feel like they're fearful, but they want to exert control over something. And they want to enact change. And we've done surveys, and we found that 75% of jurors will agree that awarding damages in a lawsuit isn't about punishing the corporation or compensating the victim, but it's about making society better as a whole by forcing corporations to enact change. And that's how they see this. And the lawyers will capitalize on those beliefs during jury selection and then certainly throughout trial.
Well, Christina, you raised an interesting point about millennials. Now, I have two teenagers who I would categorize as Generation Z. They are the ones who first, I guess, were exposed to the smartphone and were able to connect with friends, and they're different from the millennials. And I guess this is a question for all three of you, and that is, in the wake of COVID-19, how will this potentially shape a generation of jurors? What will their perspectives, for example, of corporate America be? Will they look at the frontline healthcare workers a little differently compared to prior to the pandemic? And also for the trucking industry that are on the front lines delivering food and goods and services, how do you foresee this happening? Because this summit is called Future in Focus. So let me start with you, Christina, go to you, Bob, and then to you, Yafit.
Sure. This is something that we've looked at. We have compared survey data from pre-COVID to the same questions asked post-COVID regarding corporations, attitudes towards corporations, attitudes towards the government. And what we found is that people are just becoming more polarized in their beliefs. It's not that we're becoming more negative or positive in a general direction, but jurors are just more polarized than ever before. And I think we certainly see that in our current political climate. And so plaintiff jurors has become even worse plaintiff jurors. But on the bright side, defense jurors have become even stronger defense jurors. So we see that in the recent trials since COVID, the jurors are deliberating longer. They are more contentious because they're polarized in beliefs. And the positive side, though, that we're seeing is that And we've done several jury selections now in the post-COVID environment, both by Zoom and in person. And the jurors, especially the in-person trials, who tend to be more fearful of COVID are the ones who are more likely to lean plaintiff. And so they're not getting seated on the juries because we're actually seeing older people seated on our juries, which was exactly the opposite of what we thought we would see. We thought older people would be asking for hardships based on being on high risk. But actually, these older jurors are saying, yes, I'm high risk, but I'm willing to serve. I'm not afraid. And yet we see these jurors in their 30s who don't have any comorbidities saying that they're terrified and they've got too much anxiety to serve during this pandemic. So we've actually experienced a long list of defense verdicts recently because we're seeing more conservative and older juries. Now, how long that's likely to last, we can't say, but at least in this short interim, we are seeing a positive effect of that.
That's interesting. Bob, what do you think?
So, two things. Millennials, I never really had a problem with millennials. I just don't like young people. That's okay, right? I don't think they're a protected class yet. So at least out in California, I am literally allowed to use all my challenges to get rid of young people. They're not protected. And I don't say I always do that, but they don't appreciate the value of a dollar. My kids don't even have a dollar, right? They just have like this credit card they keep with their phone. They have no idea what you can buy with a dollar, which I literally will do. I will take out to a young person and say, what can you buy with this? And 9 out of 10 times, they don't even know. Someone else has to say, oh, pack of gum, maybe. So young people, I don't have a problem with millennials, just youth, which is just another wonderful thing about growing old, isn't it? And then with respect to jurors, look, I literally am just a simple trial lawyer. I completely agree with Christina. It is much deeper than what I'm about to say. But from my simple point of view, if you can delay a trial as a defendant right now, I would delay it. If you don't have to go to trial, I wouldn't push to go. Everyone in America is on edge. I don't care what you believe in. I don't care what your race is. I don't care your age, your gender. I don't care your political beliefs. You're on edge. You feel like you're under attack. There's no winners out there right now, right? We're all at home. So when I want to seat jurors, I want people that are calm and going to be able to deliberate and listen to both sides and apply the law, not be on edge, not be edgy. Well, I'm feeling a little edgy right now. So I am concerned. I'm concerned about juries right now.
Well, Yafit, before we take questions from the audience, any thoughts on this topic?
Fascinating to hear everybody's perspectives, especially because this is an issue that the insurance industry is trying to figure out right now. From my perspective, listen, while I hope I'm absolutely wrong, I would not be surprised if we don't see a decline in nuclear verdicts. And because of that economic and mental stress that everyone is under, that was mentioned, my sense is that there's a risk that we will see increased juror sympathy for small businesses, especially, which have been disproportionately impacted here by the pandemic. I think we'll continue to see distrust of and bias against large corporations. I think that we will see more of this overall belief that money is no objects for large companies, and potentially a lack of understanding about the fact that insurance only works if the customer and the carrier are able to have that confidence that contracts are enforceable. And so all of that is really part of why at Travelers we've been, advocating for, common sense tort reform and those legal liability protections for businesses in the wake of the pandemic.
Well, thank you, Yafit. I think we've got 5 minutes to take questions from the audience. Again, if you go to www.slido.com, there should be a code that you can punch in, ILR Summit 20. Let me start with the first question here. Aren't concerns about nuclear verdicts mitigated by the Constitution, which can curb the spread of these types of damages? Bob, let me ask you that one.
Really? Constitutional law? I didn't even really do that well in constitutional law. I think I got like a B or something. And it was 30 years ago. So look, I just deal with juries, man. I wish I could change the law. I wish I was a congressman or something like that. But I'll tell you this, people will say, because I study nuclear verdicts. I study human beings, not as well as Christina does. And I'm certainly not as smart as Yafit, but I just study trials. And we see this trend of nuclear verdicts happening. And then people will say, well, doesn't it get reduced? They appeal that and that gets reduced. Not all the time. Not all the time. And me personally, I would rather educate folks on how to keep those verdicts from ever happening. And so you don't have to deal with appeals or the Constitution, because there are trial level things that you can do that human beings are going to respond to, like to diffuse anger, and you never even have to get there. Not just because I don't understand it.
Harold, just to jump in there, the Constitution actually has gone the other way in some cases. I know that in some jurisdictions, there's been a cap on non-economic damages that's been passed. And in some situations, the court has found that that was actually not constitutional. So I think it's questionable whether you could even have that, cap on non-economic damages.
Okay. Bob, I think this next question is directed to you. How have the plaintiff lawyers responded to your book?
Oh, that's a good question. So David Ball, who wrote the book, The Reptile Theory, hates me, and he's been bad-mouthing me all over the internet. He's telling people to not pay for it, like to get it some other way than to pay for it. And he has done over 6.5 hours of seminars to explain how to defeat my book. So I'm just a little bit concerned that more plaintiffs lawyers have read my book than defense lawyers. Like, we just need to get the word out, because they're doing these seminars and they're saying, don't be worried, don't be concerned. Dost thou protest too much? I think the answers are in the book, because they're all worried about it.
Well, look, we are coming to the 3:15 part of the hour. I'm going to ask in a very lightning round type of way for each of our panelists to identify probably the one state where nuclear verdicts are the worst, one state in the union. And perhaps it's also a question, if you are a defendant, where do you not want to be on the receiving end of a complaint in that particular state? So with that said, Yafit, let me start with you.
I'll go to Florida.
Florida, okay.
I do not want to be in Florida.
All right, Florida. Christina, what do you think?
Missouri has been a scary place just because anything goes in Missouri in the courtroom.
All right. And Bob, how about you?
It's a toss-up between my home state of New York, but I got to go with my current state for the last 30 years, California and downtown LA.
Well, I'm going to go with all of the above because I'm a moderator and I can do that. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us for a really thought-provoking conversation on nuclear verdicts, what to do about it. I encourage our viewers and listeners to check out Bob's book and also the good work that Yafit and Christina have been putting out there. So this is a all hands on deck effort for the business community to at least start elevating the awareness, because this is a problem and there are solutions, I can assure you, that need to be put into play in order to address some of these troubling trends. So with that, thank you for joining us, and we will now move on to the next part of our program. Take care, all.
Thanks, Harold.